Last Sunday, we looked at Revelations chapters 5 and 6. And in those chapters, we see John's vision of the Lamb. And we see that the Lamb is the only one in creation who is worthy to open the seals of a very important scroll. And it's important because the scroll contains God's plans for the culmination of history. And so we see that it's through Jesus that we have knowledge of God's plan for the future. Today, we are jumping pretty far ahead to the beginning of Revelation chapter 17, and then all of chapter 18. And before I read this, I want to acknowledge that these chapters use some pretty misogynistic language. And after we read the passage, I will address some of the possible reasons why John might be using this language. So this is Revelation, the beginning of Revelation 17, and then we'll jump to Revelation 18. Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great whore, who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and with the wine of whose fornication the inhabitants of the earth have become drunk." So he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her fornication. And on her forehead was written a name, a mystery: Babylon the Great, mother of whores and of earth's abominations. And I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses to Jesus. After this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with its splendor. He called out with a mighty voice, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. It has become a dwelling place of demons, a haunt of every foul spirit, a haunt of every foul bird, a haunt of every foul and hateful beast. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. And the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxury." Then I heard another voice from heaven saying, "Come out of her, my people, so that you do not take part in her sins, and so that you do not share in her plagues. For her sins are heaped high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Render to her as she herself has rendered, and repay her double for her deeds. Mix a double draught for her in the cup that she mixed. As she glorified herself and lived luxuriously, so give her a like measure of torment and grief. Since in her heart she says, 'I rule as a queen. I am no widow, and I will never see grief.' Therefore her plagues will come in a single day, pestilence and mourning and famine, and she will be burned with fire. For mighty is the Lord God who judges her. And the kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived in luxury with her will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. They will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, 'Alas, alas, the great city, Babylon, the mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come.' And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. Cargo of gold, silver, jewels, and pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet, all kinds of scented wood, all articles of ivory, all articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, olive oil, choice flour, and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots, slaves, and human lives. The fruit for which your soul longed has gone from you, and all your dainties and your splendor are lost to you, never to be found again. The merchants of these wares, who gained wealth from her, will stand far off, in fear of her torment, weeping and mourning aloud. Alas, alas, the great city, clothed in fine linen, in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, with jewels, and with pearls. For in 1 hour, all this wealth has been laid waste. And all shipmasters and seafarers, sailors, and all whose trade is on the sea stood far off and cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning. What city was like the great city? And they threw dust on their heads as they wept and mourned, crying out, Alas, alas, the great city, where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth. For in 1 hour she has been laid waste. Rejoice over her, O heaven, you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her. Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, With such violence, Babylon, the great city, will be thrown down and will be found no more. And the sound of harpists and minstrels and of flutists and trumpeters will be heard in you no more. And an artisan of any trade will be found in you no more. And the sound of the millstone will be heard in you no more. And the light of a lamp will shine in you no more. And the voice of bridegroom and bride will be heard in you no more. For your merchants were the magnates of the earth, and all nations were deceived by your sorcery. And in you was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all who have been slaughtered on earth. So at the beginning of chapter 17, an angel appears and tells John that he is going to show him the judgment of the great city of Babylon, who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. And my guess is that many of us cringe when we hear this kind of language used to describe a woman, even if the woman is a metaphor, not a real human being. It's clear, I think, that the woman is a symbol for the city of Rome. And John portrays the city as a woman because that is how the Romans portrayed the city, as the goddess Roma. And we've already talked in previous weeks about Roman propaganda and how the Romans deified their emperors, how they portrayed their military victories in theological terms. So they were victorious because they had the favor of the gods, and they deserved the power and the wealth that they had accrued. So the Romans had a very high opinion of themselves and of their empire. They considered themselves noble. They considered themselves the most powerful and impressive civilization in the history of the world. And this shows in their portrayals of the goddess Roma. So, for instance, there were coins that the Romans printed with the goddess printed on them. And in that, she is kind of reclining on the 7 mythic hills of Rome. She's dressed in battle garments. She's holding a sword. And she looks strong. She looks sober, at ease, and elegant. John's vision of the whore of Babylon is quite different than that portrayal. His vision punctures Rome's portrayal of itself. One commentator that I read calls this actually a satire of the goddess. So instead of a stately noblewoman, in John's vision, she is a violent, blasphemous prostitute. And in the ancient world, it was pretty similar to today. Prostitutes were looked down upon. They were treated with contempt. And whether it was true or not, people thought that they were immoral drunkards, driven solely by lust. And this is how John portrays the city of Rome, the opposite way that the Romans portrayed themselves. It's worth noting that in Revelation, there are pairs throughout the book, pairs of mirror images. So, for example, Satan and his allies are described as violent, grotesque beasts. Jesus, on the other hand, is portrayed as a lamb. Also, you might remember a different woman that we talked about earlier in this series, the woman who gives birth to a child, and the woman who represents the people of God. She's threatened by the dragon, and she also is in a wilderness. And so the Whore of Babylon is intended to be that woman's foil, or her opposite. So John continues this metaphor of sexual infidelity through chapter 18. So he says that all of the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her. Clearly, he is not talking about literal sexual intercourse. He's using the metaphor to describe the kind of relationships that characterize the city of Rome and the empire of Rome. So the agreements between Rome and other client states and other kings, these relationships, according to John, are degraded and cheap. They're about pleasure and profit, nothing more than that. And John will contrast that with the kind of relationship that characterizes the coming New Jerusalem, or the city of God, right? And he says that relationship is characterized, or that relationship is like a marriage, not like the relationship between a client and a sex worker. One of the reasons that I wanted to focus on this chapter is John's emphasis on the economics of empire. It's one of the few places in Revelation where John seems to speak very clearly. So in his vision, as Babylon is destroyed, it's the kings, it's the merchants, and it's the sailors who are standing far off, and they're weeping at the destruction of Rome. And they're weeping not because they loved Rome. They're weeping because Rome made them rich. And this is one of John's strongest critiques of the empire, that it had become obsessed with luxury and wealth and status. So much so that its clients were willing to literally worship the empire if it meant reaping monetary benefits. There's an interesting detail near the end of the chapter where John says, "Your merchants were the magnates of the earth." Or, this is a different translation, "Your merchants were the aristocrats of the earth." This is not a compliment. In John's time, merchants did not have good reputations at all. They were emblematic of people who were driven solely by the desire for wealth. They were considered dishonest and greedy. They would travel anywhere through any kind of danger if it meant they could make some money. Now, aristocrats, on the other hand, they were supposed to be examples of the empire's stated values and virtues. So they were supposed to be characterized both by sobriety, truth, wisdom, etc. So for John to say that merchants had become the nobility of the empire, this implies that the empire's virtues had been turned upside down, that greed and business interests had become the dominant value. Another interesting detail comes near the end of the chapter, where John says that Rome is going to be tied to a giant millstone and thrown into the sea. Now, giant millstones were used, obviously, to mill grain, but it was for commercial purposes, right? To make money. Giant millstones were commercial tools. And the sea was what allowed Rome to trade successfully and to become wealthy. But in the end, John says, God is going to use these symbols of prosperity against Rome in God's judgment. To me, John's indictment of Rome's greed and Rome's self-satisfaction, it hits pretty close to home. He says that the goddess, she wears purple garments, she is adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, and that she drinks from a golden cup. All of these things suggest nobility, sophistication, invincibility. But that is not how God sees Rome. That's how Romans see Rome. And it's blasphemous and arrogant. So the goddess says, I rule as a queen. I am no widow, and I will never experience grief. To my ears, this sounds eerily similar to the dogma of our civil religion, American exceptionalism. So our citizens and our politicians endlessly repeat the phrase, we are the greatest country in the history of the earth. That is a superstitious, arrogant belief in our own virtuousness, a belief that God or the gods have chosen us for perpetual victory and prosperity. And of course, our own society is obsessed with wealth and status and living luxuriously. We treat wealth as if it is a sign of nobility. We think people who have a lot of wealth will be good leaders. And if we don't have wealth ourselves, we want it. So in a commentary I was reading this week, the author writes that actually not all of John's Christian listeners would have shared his critique of Roman society. So at the beginning of the book, chapter 2, John sends messages to 7 churches in Asia Minor, and here's what he says to one of the churches. He says, I know your works. You're neither hot nor cold. I wish that you were either hot or cold, but because you are lukewarm, I am about to spit you out. For you say, I'm rich, I've prospered, and I need nothing. But you do not realize that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. So the author of the commentary writes, some people in the 7 cities were actually suppliers of the textiles, the wines, gems, marble, timber, even slaves that fed the demand of the imperial markets. They would have seen themselves standing with the merchants in this vision, bereft of their profits. And also, some people in the 7 cities presumably aspired to be consumers of the luxury goods, even if they weren't the merchants. And this, to me, brings up some really uncomfortable questions. Like, in what ways do I benefit from the beastly aspects of our society and of our economy? What does it mean if I am comfortable in an economic system that degrades many people to serve a few? John doesn't give any specific instructions to those people or to us. So he does say, come out of her, my people, so that you do not take part in her sins, and so that you do not share in her plagues. Same commentator writes that this exhortation engages readers in a process of discernment, in which they must continue over and over to ask which commercial practices are incompatible with their commitments to God and the Lamb. That is a continual process. It's uncomfortable because it means looking at our habits. It means looking at the ways that we make money through this lens. And it means asking, well, are we actually willing to give up measures of comfort, measures of security, even if they are false securities? Are we willing to forego, for instance, owning stocks in companies that profit from the weapons of war? Or that profit from exploiting people, either here or out of sight? Now, one common argument that I tell myself, and I'm sure other people do, is, well, if I change these little things about my own life, is it really going to change anything about our economic system? That's not John's point at all. He did not think that it would change the Roman economic system, right? He knew that it was going to fall inevitably, right? It is a matter of principle and it's a matter of allegiance. So John tells us that those who cling to their allegiance to God and to the Lamb, they conquer, they are victorious. Even if they die, they are victorious. Which means that every time we make a decision for the Lamb against other interests, that this is actually a victory. Wealth and comfort and getting ahead. These things are incredibly alluring and tempting, and we don't even notice many times when we are giving those things our allegiance. But in this vision, John shows that underneath all of it, it is empty and it is going to be desolated. John is challenging his readers here for the ones who are wealthy, who are comfortable. He's trying to challenge them against complacency with the empire. He's trying to warn them against self-satisfaction, to warn them of a beastly economic system and its dangers. And that is a message and an exhortation for us as well.